Yeah, hopefully you can see that all right. Um, Thank you very much to the R-HTA group for allowing us the opportunity to present this panel today. We're going to be talking on enhancing cooperation between clinical evidence generation and economic modelling in HTA, how R can help. You'll see three amused chaps here. Our panelists, this is not our panelist having a joke about FlexServe or anything. Our panelists are rather younger than these guys here. So let me introduce you to, well, myself. I'm from MSD. I manage a team that looks after an oncology portfolio, worked in pharma and consulting, and as Rob mentioned in this, our consortium working group for HTA. Today, I have the pleasure to be joined by three colleagues from industry. Greg Chen is principal scientist at MSD, also in the HTA statistics group. He's a statistician, worked in pharma for more than 15 years in a variety of functions, active in various internal and external research and software collaborations, OpenStatsWare, our consortium, and the American Statistical Association group. He's a co-author of MAIC Plus. Anders Gorst-Rasmussen is head of HTA data science at Novo Nordisk in Copenhagen. Again, he's a statistician, worked across in over 20 years in various domains, most recently in Novo Nordisk for the last 10 years in late phase development, and dedicated to HTA market access for 4 years. He's also authored a package, AHAS, and is actively engaged in PSI, EFSP, and the R Consortium Working Group. And Rob Hettle is Director of Health Technology Assessment and Modelling Science at AstraZeneca in Cambridge. He's responsible for HTA analysis and modelling, and work includes statistical analysis and economic modelling, a long time in health economics, including consultancy and global pharma, and he's used R for over 10 years. So our declarations for Greg and I, that we're both employees, views expressed in this presentation are our views and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or opinion of our employers, its subsidiaries, or affiliates. So, getting to the topic in hand, firstly, the way we're going to do this is each of us is going to present briefly for sort of about 10 minutes each, and then we'll hopefully open it up for questions and commentary. So please do be active on the chat. I'll figure out a way of actually being able to see the chat in a minute, but I can't see it right now. But yeah, please do put your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll tackle them as a group. Yeah, so just to start off and introduce, I wanted to really flag the size and scope of a typical pharmaceutical company being rather quite large, and there being many pressures within that kind of system to specialize into particular roles. And I ask, is that a feature or a bug? Be that we are specialists, or does it risk creating silos? And yeah, it does create that risk. The pressures to specialize, I think, come from the fact that drug development occurs in many different phases, starting with safety and efficacy, and then we might move on to clinical effectiveness and anything to do with economics. We have clinical trials that are not a continuous stream of data, but instead are carefully designed with predetermined interim and final analysis data points. We have regulators that examine things step by step, HTA bodies that again examine firstly the clinical effectiveness and then move on to considerations around efficiency and affordability. Then once we have an HTA evaluation, reimbursement, access, and pricing can be agreed. And we have competition and reappraisals from time to time, and the world is obviously increasingly complex. And you'll observe, of course, that every function in a pharmaceutical company plays its own role in ensuring patients can access safe and effective medicines and vaccines. One step of that is the HTA, but it's one step of many. And you'll have all these different functions: the clinical people who run the trials, the medical affairs who are close to the the medics and stakeholders at the country and global level, statistics, health economics, which we're talking about today, outcomes research, real-world evidence, market access, commercial, epidemiology, regulatory, manufacturing. All of these many and varied different functions each have a role to play, and a strong global health economics lead navigates across all of them and makes sure that whether it's an internal discussion or an external discussion with a supplier or an HTA, people have the right information, it's correct, and it's lined up, and it's so yeah, these are just large organizations to navigate, and that is where the slide gets stuck. Here we are. So yeah, just to highlight the point again, different stakeholders are likely to have very different needs from any health economic modeling for HTA. And this idea of division of labor, which a colleague flagged to me, which I think was a Bradley Efron construct from a while ago, that can be helpful, because then you're using the specialisms of each person at each point in the chain to address that particular specialism. But certainly research is needed to understand and then address the barriers to adopting modern health economic modeling technologies, particularly scripted approaches where R can help. A lot of us are still using Excel, whereas I think most of us at this conference at least would like to be moving across to R. So I'll hand over, that's just a brief introduction, and I'll hand over to Greg to give us your perspective here. And please let me know when you want to move forward a slide.
Thank you, Dominic. And thank you also to this workshop for the opportunity to speak here. In the next 10 minutes or so, I would like to share some example of the statistical analysis based on my experience and observation over the past years. This example hopefully can illustrate the type of evidence generated for HTA purposes that require collaboration across multiple business functions. I will then briefly touch upon how R can facilitate this process and the key challenges associated with its broader adoptions and potential opportunity that open source collaboration may offer. Next slide, please. While clinical study reports are crucial for regulatory purposes, they often do not provide all the necessary clinical insight for HTA decisions. Some HTA statistical analyses are dedicated to fill in the gap in the those clinical insights, while some analyses serve as input primarily for economic modeling or fulfill both purposes. Next slide, please. Let's maybe begin with a topic that many of you are likely familiar with, the long-term survival extrapolation. So this statistical analysis is primarily used to derive input to support the economic model. However, it's important to know that it's not merely a numerical exercise aimed to find the best AIC or BIC. Beyond the obvious consideration for model choices, there are several additional aspects that require interdisciplinary coordination among economic, statistics, clinical expertise, and epidemiologies. So, for examples, such as assessing the tail region, which might then acquire real data to seek for validation about the external validity, some sanity check on possible conflict among the endpoints, such as we may expecting the tail of the OS to be above PFS everywhere, no matter which final model we are deemed for each of the endpoints. We may also making assumptions about proportional hazard. Then the question could come to, is it appropriate to assume long-term proportional hazard assumption over 20, 30 years? And if it's not reasonable, how should we break it down into pieces? How many pieces? How do we going to assume the treatment effect to winding down across the time? These are the conversations that we will need to possibly engage in clinical medical affair together with economists and statisticians to talk about that, because it could also have a ripple effect to what kind of assumption that regulatory side is working on. Next slide, please. So second example, maybe we take a look on the health utility analysis based on EQ5D in oncology trial. So here, statisticians first need to work with economists to find the right algorithm for a country to convert the patient-reported outcome data into the utility value. And in the full set of the analysis, because the longitudinal nature of the PRO data, or after you translated the utility values, they might involving some longitudinal analysis model to estimate the average per interested health status and their estimation uncertainty. So for most of the longitudinal models, violation of the missing at random assumption and or the existence of the outlier might have different degree of impacts. This again will require statistician, economist, and possibly clinical experts to sit together to discuss about the degree of violation and if there's a need to plan for sensitivity analysis to provide a complementary perspective. Next slide, please. So maybe the next example we could look into is at about treatment switching analysis for overall survival. The overall survival is probably undoubtedly one of the most critical clinical endpoints in oncology trial, but it has its complication. And one of its complication is that in the trial setting, usually the patient might not stick with the assigned starting medication until the end of the study follow-up period. There's all kinds of subsequent treatment could be reflected also in the trial for the patient in either of the treatment group. And so those kind of treatment, if the subsequent treatment effect are also being absorbed into the overall survival estimate, then the question comes to, can we make a statistical analysis to adjust for that? The answer is yes. However, depends on the purposes, the kind of way we're approaching it, the way we're doing it might be different. So from regulatory perspective, they may have a keen interest to eliminating all the confounding. That meaning maybe adjusting for both, focus on adjusting just in some trial that in the protocol design, they allow for the comparator arm patients to switch to the experimental arm. So that could be the focus of the adjustment. Or in other cases, maybe they want to deriving a sensitivity analysis to as a complementary perspective to look at how about in an ideal world that we eliminate all the possible subsequent anti-cancer therapy away. What is the pure overall survival estimate will be looking like just for the starting medication? However, in the HTA, maybe we that's not our keen interest, right? And this relying on the discussion primarily with economist, statistician, and medical affair and market access colleague, maybe in different country. What are the realistic post-launching treatment paths that will be looking like so that we can determine maybe a set of the subsequent treatment that one would like to be adjusted for. Next slide, please. And maybe this is the last example that was to be shared today, that this for German HTA submission, primarily there are additional statistical analysis beyond CSR will be required. And typically this analysis focus on as a clinical, additional clinical evidence rather than input to economic models. The key interest there is to focus on patient-relevant endpoints, to conducting, so in the safety analysis, they will look over the typical overall safety endpoints, such as any AE, serious AE, severe AE. They will look into the breakdown by SOC and PT, and look into subgroup analysis over efficacy, safety, PRO endpoints, including statistical interaction tests to see if the treatment effect is consistent across the important subgroup factors. Such analysis might be required to repeat it across subpopulations. So it will be a huge volume of insights, depending on the protocol, of course. So then the key question here is that a statistician have a key role here to play to consolidate, to at least helping internal non-statistical stakeholders to go over this large volume of insight generated, because they're going to be sit in the public domain after the assessment has been conducted, so that the team can maybe start this discussion earlier internally to go over the kind of finding, to prepare assessment to see how many of them are actually chance finding, taking into account the multiplicity issues. Next slide, please. So across the there are more variety of the possible HTA statistical analysis could be conducted beyond. The example presented before is kind of just a teaser, but across all this, I personally think I have an important role that could be helpful here, not just because it itself integrated well into starting from data preparation into reporting, is everything could be done within this R languages. It has a very rich ecosystem with R packages. Typically, the cutting-edge methodology are quickly available in R, and it also is usually friendly to more modern kind of facilities such as GitHub, and it has own mechanisms such as RENV, R packages to ensure reproducibility. If one want to freeze the kind of implementation environment and reproduce it in the future time, they could do so. And there's also transparency. One could simply print out the session info, etc., to be clear which basic R version, what R packages, what version of them have been used for the analysis. So all this from the technical sides make R appealing, but not to forget that I think the strength of R is also in the visualization and automation part. As the example briefly based upon before, that there's a lot of communication statistician and economist might need to undertake beyond non-technical audience. So in order to help to make the model correct, to interpret the result correct, some feasibility assessment, some visualization of the result would need to be carried out. And R has a powerful feature and functionality in that regard. Next slide, please. Adopting R is not always so smooth. It has its own challenges as an open source software, and maybe the key challenges could be summarized into these 4 aspects. There are too many packages to be choosing for, so there's a question about how to ensure the quality and validation. There's based on the it's a more question about practice, that how to ensure the version control for reproducibility. And because it's an open source software, there's no commercial company behind it, how to resolving the maintenance supporting issue. And also because it's not a commercial software, it maybe leave it up to each of the individual company and even to the HTA body or regulatory side to their own IT infrastructure to make some tailor-making system about the implementation and deployment. My last slide, please. So I just want to ending by calling out that open source collaboration can help with addressing a lot of this, and maybe just to highlighting 2 particular aspects that open source can help in with. One is about this quality and validation, right? So we have R-HTA consortium, we have OpenStats, where can this kind of cross-industry collaboration that try to building R tools following good software engineering practice. We also have initiative like the HTA working group in R consortium. One of the working stream try to look into commonly validating a common a pool of R packages that can facilitate HTA purposes, let it be additional clinical assessment or economic modeling, right? And there's also initiatives such as chemists to cross-validating R result and SAS result, which seems to be an inevitable topic, considering the majority of the regulatory result is done in SAS, right? So open source collaboration really help in that regard. And lastly, open source collaboration also forming community ready behind so that the important R packages that we decided to use it in our day-to-day practice for HTA purposes no longer just have one individual, one team behind it. You actually have an active community, a cross-industry collaboration community behind it, so that hopefully if one drop the ball, the other could pick up. I will end here. Thank you for the time, and I will pass back to Dominic, and look forward to a discussion.
Yeah. Thank you, Greg. I see one question already. I hope it's okay if we take the questions all at the end. Please do add them into the chat. Thank you, Greg, and I'll hand over to Anders.
Great, thanks a lot. And luckily, I think both Dom and Greg did all the hard lifting in terms of introducing the topics, and I think also some of the challenges that I'll be pushing on here in my part. And if you can advance to the next slides. And these are my declarations, the next one again. So I framed this as an HTA statistician perspective, but as I was listening to Greg and Dom speak, I think it's actually more the perspective of an HTA statistician that is now heading up an HTA statistics functions, because I think I'm approaching this more from a bit of an organizational perspective. And I'm going to lead with what may be an unpopular opinion, I think, in this forum, that from my personal perspective, I don't really care whether it's R that will solve this or any other kind of platform. But I think right now, R is probably the best bet that we have in terms of addressing these workflow challenges that I think we're experiencing across different functional areas. Why is the pharmaceutical industry set up like it is? I think there's a good reason for that. You have the right people sitting together at the right points in the product life cycle. But I think what we're experiencing also right now is that whenever you set things up like this, there's a risk of forming silos. I think we're seeing increasingly also in the pharmaceutical industry this push for shortened timelines, this push for delivering more and more, which increasingly also leads to functions that are looking maybe more inwards, and you could say solving more locally for the problems that are more immediate to them. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because it of course also provides some challenges when we're handing over between the different functions. And I think this dynamics is also very much compounded by the size of the company that you're looking at. So some of the problems or challenges or opportunities, as I would like to frame them, that we're discussing today, may not be very visible to people that are sitting in a consultancy, for example, where you may have everything, you could say, sitting within one function, both doing the clinical effectiveness side of things and the health economic side of things. And it may also not be very obvious to those of you that are sitting in academia that really a key pain point, I think, also of industry is how do we deal with the challenges in setting up the right kind of workflows. And I have some examples on the right-hand side here. I think Greg has already spoken to the one about the subgroup and subpopulation analysis, specifically pertaining to the AMNOG dossier. So I think what we saw in the past, also where maybe the push for faster timelines was less, was that more was done on the regulatory side before handing over to those that would be doing the HTA type work. Whereas nowadays what we see is increasingly lean clinical study reports, and you can say also regulatory statistician teams that are solving more narrowly for the problems that they're encountering when they're doing regulatory work. And that sort of leaves, you can say, a function such as mine, which is sitting in between the regulatory statistics side of things and the HOR, a little bit in the squeeze, because we basically have to with a lot of things, also start from scratch. I think a lot of this, and maybe this will get resolved in the coming years. Right now, we're in a little bit of a limbo, I think, also in a lot of places in the pharmaceutical industry with respect to tool fragmentation. I think there's a lot of faith also in tools like R and Python also coming in and revolutionizing also how we produce evidence for the regulatory package. But right now, it's a little bit of a mix. For example, just within my own company, we see some of the clinical projects are heavily reliant on R. Others are still heavily reliant on SAS. Others are doing a bit of a hybrid thing. And you can say all of this combined with need for handover throughout also complicates things. Then I think in terms of, and maybe that is a little bit more of a ways of working than a platform type issue. But I think something that we are very often seeing when we're working on our side is, again, because we are working on one part of the problem and our colleagues sitting in health economy are working on a different part of the problem, is that we tend to maybe, and I think it has to do with the sequential way of working, of running extensive analysis on the clinical effectiveness side that are intended for input to the health economic modeling that then ends up having a relatively small impact. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that things are going on in sequence. So, you have the health economics team that are sitting and waiting around for whatever type of advanced analysis come out of the HTA statistician team. When they have these analyses, they can deploy and test their modeling, and then they can circle back and say, well, this didn't work. Can you do another round? And I think sort of the core of the problem here is really these sequential workflows. I mean, all the way from the regulatory side of things over the HTA stats things, and then back to the health economists that are building the cost effectiveness models. If you go to the next slide. So these are just some high-level reflections on how can R help, trying to also answer the question of this session here. So I think the answer that Greg has already hinted at is of course enabling harmonization. So another way of tackling, you could say, what is in many ways also a consequence of how we set up the organization, is of course to organize differently. You can say maybe you need to push, say, the HTA statisticians to a different place in the organization. But I think there's a reason why we're organized the way we are in different companies. For example, I'm very happy that my team is sitting closer to the development side of the organization, because it means that we have a lot easier access to data. We have a lot easier alignment also with the regulatory side of things. So I think it's very much about thinking more in terms of platforms. What key aspects can we align so that we can make the handover much more easy? And then I think maybe sticking a little bit with my last point below, I think R is a much more natural kind of backbone for taking, you could say, more of a software engineering type mindset on when you're working both across the clinical effectiveness side and the HOR side of things, where I think we need to think much more about how can we do, say, these sprint-based workflows with MVPs. I mean, both on the side of what we're producing in terms of clinical effectiveness input, but also on the health economic modeling side, so that we can test also the economic impact a lot more early before investing in very complex statistical work. And I think for the vendors that are on this call, I think it really also calls for rethinking both how we set up. I mean, when we are using as a pharma company vendors for our work, how do we set up, the right kind of agreements with vendors in order to be able to support an infrastructure like this? How can we have line of sight also between what is happening at our side and what is happening on the model development side in real time, so that we can adjust as we go along? And I think in terms of how the infrastructure is right now, I think we're not there yet, but I'm quite sure that you can say investing more in R as a solution will help us get there. Good. I think that concludes my key points.
Okay, thank you, Anders. Move on to Rob, and then we'll come to questions after that. Rob.
Super. Thank you, Dom. Thank you, Anders. Thank you, everyone. I'll try and keep this relatively brief because I really want to get to some of the questions and discussions. I think it would be really, really insightful. But hello to everyone. My name's Hettle. I'm Director of Health Technology Assessment Modelling Science, AstraZeneca Global. And I'm just going to give a little bit of a health economic modeler perspective, I think, on some of the opportunities and challenges with R. And look forward to any comments, questions as we go through. Dom, can you move to the next slide, please? We've all consistently shown our disclaimers and declarations. So AstraZeneca employee, the views expressed here are those of mine only, not of the company, etc. So next slide, please. So a little bit of context, and this is actually quite similar to what was mentioned by the previous speakers as well. But within AstraZeneca, similar to other companies, the teams that work on HTA and modelling science type work, so cost effectiveness modelling, indirect treatment comparison, so on, sit across different parts of the organisation, which obviously has implications for how we work together. So at AstraZeneca, myself and my health economics colleagues sit within our market access group and our commercial function. Our friends in biometrics, statistics and programming sit within the R&D organization. As Anders nicely outlined in the previous presentation, that obviously has benefits as well as drawbacks, and there's specific reasons why that happens in terms of protocols and the way we operate, etc. But very much the way we sort of have to develop our materials, prepare for submissions, etc., is sort of a bit of a team sport. It doesn't, rely on an individual or set of individuals. It's very much a team that involves our colleagues in statistics, our commercial colleagues, medical colleagues, pricing colleagues, etc. So when we think of decisions around choice of software, etc., which may seem fairly trivial, there are quite a few aspects to that and opinions that get thrown in. In terms of where we find ourselves at the moment, I think we're definitely in a stage of evolution, which I think is fantastic. So it gives us opportunities. It also, I think, leads to challenges, and many of those challenges my fellow panelists have raised as well. But we're seeing sort of evolving science and regulatory pathways. Everything is getting much faster. Timelines are shrinking. There's a real need and demand to get sort of decision making done quicker, which is good in many respects, but also challenging from a development perspective. We're also seeing, I think, growing analytical demand across from a sort of global perspective. So I sit within our global function, and we see a growth of HTA around the world, which increases the number of requests we get, etc. We have the EU Joint Clinical Assessment, which has come into force for oncology this year as well. I won't talk too much about that today, but it does have an impact, I think, on our workflows. We're seeing a rich vein of methodological advancements in statistics and modeling techniques, which is fantastic, but does also impart demand. And in particular in oncology, which is the area I work in, there's a hugely dynamic and evolving treatment landscape. So we can see over the course of a fairly conventional clinical trial period that the whole landscape has changed. And what was standard of care and our comparator at the beginning of the trial was very different to the end, etc. So it's a very dynamic environment that we have to work within. I think also we need to be mindful of the fact that when it comes to launch medicines, when we bring medicines to market, the main evidence source in almost all cases is our clinical trials, our randomized clinical trials. So all these demands that we have, this sort of new evidence that we need, gets placed more and more on those clinical trials, which can be challenging. Next slide, please. So I think many of these points have been picked up by others in the presentation, so I won't dwell too much on these. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, we do see these new complexities, these sort of faster turnaround periods as well. Driven sometimes by the science of the medicines, but also by policy and changes to pathways, etc. The advancements of new methodologies is fantastic, helps us tackle old problems, but there is sort of a knock-on effect when we think about implementing them within our workflows, but also bringing stakeholders along in that sort of alignment on these new methodologies, etc. And those stakeholders could be internal, but also external as well. I think, as Anders mentioned earlier on, there is a range of packages and connection points that happen over the course of a program. You've got different stats packages being used for different parts of the analysis, whether it's for the regulatory perspective, or for analyses that are going to JCA or IQWiG in Germany, through to everything else, which is where R sort of fits in quite neatly. And then obviously we have these challenges around evidence exchange, typically relied on for basic data file sharing platforms and so on. So a lot of challenges here, a lot of sort of need to try and figure out how do we plug these things together in an effective and efficient manner, given the sort of shortening of timelines that we're seeing. And then we move on to the next slide, please. And this is my final slide. I just want to end on a little bit of a note around where R could fit in. What are the opportunities from my perspective? I think on the first point, again, I think all my fellow panelists have raised this as well, but R is uniquely scalable, uniquely open source, and in theory provides us the vehicle to make end-to-end solutions. So that's really important, because we think about the turnaround times that we're looking at and the need to generate these analyses quite quickly after readout. The ability to scale this, but the ability to prepare in advance, I think is hugely important. The other thing I'm quite interested in myself personally is also the opportunity that frameworks like Quarto provide us. Quarto books, for example. We're seeing huge volumes of analyses now potentially as a result of new HTA policies. And so a future challenge, I think, is around how do we handle that? How do we manage that? The Quarto books framework potentially gives us a way of doing that. And obviously R is uniquely placed to take on board digital solutions, so artificial intelligence and so on. And I know a lot of people have presented some really excellent sort of approaches to that over the course of the conference. And then finally, I wanted to end a little bit on a slightly divisive topic in the form of economic models. I suppose it's the last island in the sea of R, basically, that hasn't been fully absorbed within this community from a HTA perspective. And I think obviously if I surveyed this group here, I think I'd get a fairly homogeneous set of results. But moving to the wider community, it's probably less homogeneous and so on. But I think it's worth reflecting on the barriers here a little bit. So as a global function, when we deliver our models to our local markets, we sort of have to take into account all the diverse needs of those markets. So not just the major HTA markets that everyone's familiar with, but also the smaller ones as well. And I think part of the reason Excel is sort of fairly universal is sort of a rule of lowest common denominator. And when we sort of have internal discussions about leveraging R and looking at R modeling, there's always the question of efficiency, etc. And I know everybody here, I think, is quite familiar with that, because there's definitely some ongoing work and projects that are looking to address that. The other point I want to bring up is the skills gap, uncertainty piece. I think, again, that's really been addressed quite well by this community. I think there's a huge amount of work ongoing to spread the use of R, which is great. But the one big thing I want to flag and maybe get the perspective on is, the efficiency side of thing I think is quite clear. I think it's quite well known. It's quite hard to argue against, I think, as an Excel user and so on. Transparency obviously is in the eye of the beholder a little bit, but fundamentally I think R gives you the opportunity to do things quicker and faster. The big question I think I face and think about when talking about the use of R is, what impact will it have? Will it enable better access to medicines? Will it hinder that? Will it have no direct impact at all? And so I think there's a question here about, not just about efficiency and not just about, how do we, handle sort of the future of HTA, etc. I think there's a question about how can R help potentially improve access to medicines and make processes smoother, faster, etc. And then finally, I'll close there, just to say, R, I think, is here for the future. I think it's clearly well suited to the analysis demands that we face. There's a lot of potential here to automate information flows, and just to say thank you to the community for all the work they do to make the packages that we use quite regularly. And I will finish there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. I see we have 3 questions. I haven't been able to see what they are, so let me hopefully just take them one by one. Okay, so Darren Burns, hang on, let's go on now. Right, the current package ecosystem on the health economic side is itself quite siloed at the moment. There are large packages to do all aspects of HT modeling in one place. However, for something like statistics, which is more specific or feeding into individual parts of a CE model, would it not be much more useful to have a broken down package infrastructure at HEverse to Pharmaverse to allow statisticians to directly link their outputs into how they, I can't read I'm sorry, Darren. Yeah, I'm going to copy these into a place where I can actually read them. Right, please excuse me. Would it not be much more useful to have broken down package infrastructure and HEverse to Pharmaverse to allow statisticians to directly link their outputs into how they are likely to be used in practice, whether internally or at a consultancy? And I'm not sure who would like to take that question. All about breaking up the packages a bit more.
I think from my perspective, I like the Pharmaverse idea, Tidyverse, etc. I think there's probably a stage of standardization that probably needs to happen. I think it would help tremendously. How far you go to break these things down is probably a subject for another day, maybe. But yeah, I fundamentally would agree. I think trying to consolidate what we have would be very useful.
Okay. Maybe we should keep going on some of the other questions. Someone asks, what do you think should change in order for R to become a real option in terms of HE modeling for HTA submissions? Incentives. I noticed, Rob, you mentioned the challenge that you hear and I hear as well. You know, how is switching a software going to help patient access? And that's always a bit of a challenge to answer, because the link isn't directly there. But any thoughts on what would need to change?
It's a difficult one because it needs a case study. Is probably the case. I mean, incentives is maybe not the word I would use. I think it's trying to understand how a HTA decision maker and assessment group would react to an R-based model, both in terms of how would they assess it, what would be the implications of that. Trying to understand that would be quite useful. But I agree with Dom. It's a question we get, but it's a question that's very difficult to answer until you've got examples. And so I suspect that's part of the barriers here, is that nobody's got an example to point to go, yeah, that resulted in a faster decision making process, and that is the benefit. Basically, I think that's the holy grail a little bit.
Yeah, and Anders, you have a point here as well.
And I think it's something that we are discussing also quite intently in the R Consortium HTA working group, that at the end of the day, and I think you have a point there as well, Rob, that you know, there needs to be some tangible value associated with this. I mean, you will not be sitting as an assessor clapping in your hands if you know, okay, now there is yet another entry barrier for me I mean, there needs to be some clear value to using R. I mean, whether that be, and I think maybe right now for a lot of agencies, you know, it's very much on you know, making their work simpler, easier. So I think, you know, speaking to that, and not necessarily, because I think that's sometimes where our discussions end up going, right? That look at all these state-of-the-art type methods and methodologies that you can deploy, because academia is developing more for R, but that we need to flip the story also more to look at how much more efficient and how much more transparent it becomes when we are pushing things in R instead of Excel.
Thank you. And Greg, there's a couple more questions. Do you want to add on this one?
Yeah, just quickly add on this one, just want to highlighting on that, other than improving efficiency, just to add on that what could maybe make others would like to use it more, not to forget the powerhouse of visualization capability of R and passing on interactive tools such the Shiny framework to make those visualization that can help to digest the large volume of the data in the clinical economic side to be generated for the HTA body. That could be also a real incentive for them to thinking about using R.
Yeah, we saw a nice example earlier from Pentag in non-inferiority. But I know Javier had a couple of follow-up questions, but if I move on to some of the other people who've asked questions, Rob Smith, and this may be relevant to what Greg, you're just saying, but how can we make our code materials easier to adopt within industry? Are there industry-specific barriers that we are not considering enough from academia or consulting? Any particular barriers that people would point to? I know from our side, trying to bring in a new tool is difficult if we need to use our own IT services and make sure that no data leaks from outside the organization. So cloud-based technologies are always a bit troublesome from that.
I think
maybe that's a.
I think it depends on the kind of code materials that we're talking about, right? I mean, as one thing is bringing in a statistical tool that's one thing. I think what we, and I spoke to that a little bit, are sometimes struggling with is when you have a vendor that is developing a complex health economic model that we are delivering the clinical effectiveness input to. I think having enough of line of sight of what is happening on either side is sometimes a challenge. So I would very much welcome, you could say more modular ways of trying to build models. I mean, where it makes sense, where it's easier for us. For example, I mean, one thing that takes up a huge amount of time is diagnosing when you get results that is the error sitting on our side in terms of the input that we're producing, the clinical effectiveness input, or is it a bug or an error that's sitting at the vendor side in terms of the code that they'd set up? So anything that can add to increasing the transparency, also what is going on at a vendor side, and maybe you could say a more modular building blocks type approach also to models where it makes sense, I think would be a huge help to industry.
Okay. And Howard, do we have time for just one more question? I see Dawn asked a good question that we haven't come to yet.
I think we do, yes.
Okay, so Dawn asks, why do you think we don't have an R validation hub for HTA yet? And what can we do to change that? This would appear to be the obvious solution to a lot of these issues, and there does appear to be a lot of interest. An R validation hub.
So maybe
Greg,
I
you
can
have your hand up.
Yes, so maybe I can chime in first on this one. I think I share that our consortium HTA working group has a working stream try to do this, right? So maybe a little bit difficult for me to help to summarizing why historically we haven't had one yet, but at the time we start to realizing more and more this is a common struggle and looking across, we don't have one. And maybe partially is because this is going to be a major undertake and it's more than just selecting few R packages and put them in a hub and say, there you go, just use this one, don't use anything else. Because I guess ideally we putting a set of the criteria that will be transparent enough and assessing across all the possible all the R packages out there that can do the typical task for HTA evidence assessment economic model and putting some recommendation out there to say that which one is more ready for production usage, but not really forming a small club of R packages just from the optic size that one may asking that, well, what this R package particularly make into the car versus the other, right? That will be just maybe a high level point to flag. And second thing is that different version of R packages is a real challenge for R validation, a common R validation in general, because we could always come up with a criteria and maybe to a certain degree we can automate the way we qualify them, right? making some technical metrics to say about each of the R packages, but it's important to know that we always say about certain R package and a certain R version, and different packages are maintained by different individual and team. Not everybody have a same standard about what they're going to do about their version updating. And for production usage in company, once a certain version of R package have been used for one analysis since it kick off, it's a little bit harder to change over time. And every time to change it, there's a substantial work need to be taken on to make sure up version effort is backwards compatible. And so those are some challenges. I will put a link from the working stream from R Consortium and HTA working group that have some initial thoughts about what aspects to look into, how to qualify R packages commonly. And maybe Dom, if you have interest, please give us your input on that. And I think the working group will be very welcome for volunteers to also helping in there.
Thank you very much, Greg. And Javier, I don't think we quite got to all of your questions, but maybe the panelists here can follow up on some of those. Otherwise, Howard, I think we're concluding, and back over to you.
Thanks very much, Dominic, and thank you very much for our panelists for a really nice close to the day.